Hi everyone, I'm Peter Bibler, Managing Director at Behring Regional Center. It's been a few years for me since I've seen everyone in person, so it's quite a delight for me personally to see new friends and old here. Behring Regional Center is, we've been around since 2013. We have 700 million in assets under development, hoping to start launching about 200 to 300 more million assets here in 2023 for EB-5 3.0 as it's been described and we'll probably talk about today.
What are some of the biggest things that changed with the RIA by way of process for somebody who is interested in raising EB-5 in this industry or somebody who's already been involved? Get me to that point where you're ready to raise new EB-5 capital.
EB-5 3.0, right? So there's been a whole regime change. We had a couple of hiccups in the implementation of that, but we're here now. One of those key changes is a whole alphabet of forms. To get started, if you don't have a regional center or you're not working with a regional center, you're going to have to start with the 956. And that form 956 is getting increasingly expensive, but you're going to lay out that process. But now, they've bifurcated the system. So there's a couple things going on. One, each project, historically you had to go through this optional exemplar process. If you wanted to get USCIS pre-approval, you could file the I-924, get the documents out, get the pre-approval, and it kind of help kickstart marketing for developers and for offering if you had that stamp of approval. It's changed now, but you have the 956F form that replaces that. And then for regional centers, the new commercial enterprises, in some cases the developers or the job creating entities, especially if it's an affiliated, and we'll talk about that I'm sure, but there's background checks now. And I think these are some of the integrity measures that came out of the RIA. They're 7 years in the making. We've seen this coming for some time, but it does provide more transparency or at least more confidence in this program, knowing that the people, the players in the program have been subject to background checks and kind of carving out those bad boys out of the process.
I think this would be a good opportunity to kind of get everyone's comments on something like that. Depending on how long you've been around, your track record, those could have been a boost. Certainly now investors are going to be more focused on kind of the nuts and bolts of the project. We can go down the line. What are your thoughts? What are you sharing with clients when it comes to how to put trust in your company without saying that 924 pre-approval?
I think in this environment, we've mentioned flight to quality, safety, due diligence. Investors now, with the increased investment amount, it's a much more substantial commitment, and you have investors that really, as always, but more importantly now, looking for safety. And I think in part, aside from track record, is to see who's behind this real estate platform, who's behind this project. And there you have, who are the partners? Do you have institutional buy-in into this project? Do you have institutional banks in this project? Because these types of players, this type of sophistication provides much more due diligence than any individual investor could possibly do on their own or through their partners, their immigration agents and so forth. The other aspect too is asset type. I think we've learned a lot of lessons with the COVID pandemic. There are certain types of assets, certain types of projects that are more robust when facing economic headwinds, whether that's pandemic, inflation, high interest rates. For us anyway, the answer to that is residential housing, student housing. These are projects that we're attracted to because our thesis is that everybody needs a place to live. They might not be buying housing right now, but everybody needs a place to rent. These are some of the factors that we focus on.
There's another component to it. Peter, you've always been able to count model-derived indirect and induced jobs. The model-derived direct jobs have been a little bit of a, how are we going to do this? How to make sure that we're safe on this? But now they've kind of codified that.
Right. Yeah, that's been codified now. And I think one of the key factors to consider is, the construction timeline. It made it codified specifically, whether this construction is 2 years or longer or 2 years or fewer. And if that makes a big difference as to a number of minimum direct jobs that need to be calculated or need to be mandated by your EB-5 project. A difference between 10% direct jobs versus 25% direct jobs. In this environment, we are attracted to smaller, more nimbler assets that are quicker to cash flow, quicker to construction completion. But we still have to be mindful and sensitive to that 2-year component, because if it is less than 2 years, then your multipliers and how many direct jobs you can count are fewer. It's a challenge that can be overcome. It's just something that developers, regional centers need to take into careful consideration when working with an economist to develop these numbers and to develop how much capital to put in for EB-5, or how much to allocate for EB-5 in that capital stack.
As this starts to change, and I know a gentleman in the panel just before lunch had mentioned you should be cautious to look at EB-5 deals where EB-5 might play the role of a senior lender, in that, that senior lender has kind of put their stamp on that project. There's a lot to say about that. I think senior lenders they don't care about the EB-5 position in the capital structure. At the end of the day, they're going to protect their interests. The appraisals they get, unless you're an intended user on it, you can't rely on. You're going to be doing your own homework, and you got to be prepared to administer those loans like a senior lender would. Are you guys looking at those structures? Are you using those structures? And what would someone need to do to protect themselves in those situations? And Peter, that one might have been a little bit more up your alley too, because I think you guys might be looking at structures like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think if the deal makes sense, with this high interest rate environment, EB-5 is becoming much more attractive and much more competitive. In certain respects, on the type of project of a residential real estate project, being in a senior position could make sense, or in a stretch mezz position when you're covering both. But I think one of the other aspects that we found very welcoming in the EB-5 community is, especially now in this EB-5 3.0, you have obviously the need for safety, but you also have investors in this environment that want their money working for them. And they're not always content with the traditional mezz debt approach where there's very little return on their investment. And so attracting investors into a capital stack of the right project is sometimes just giving them more opportunities to access that capital stack. And that would be other potential investment structures, preferred equity, even common equity in certain deals. We've had good success with that, where investors have had more flexibility in how they invest and how they, for EB-5 green cards.
What are some of the things by way of job creation buffers? What are some of the other things by way of additional protections that you think are important for people to have, for people to be considering if they're looking at projects where EB-5 is maybe playing both the senior and the mezz position?
I think for us anyway, construction completion guarantees have been mentioned. I mean, it's only as good as, the paper's only as good as the person that signed it and the institution that signed it. You check that with their financial statements. These are required typically by banks, and a minimum liquidity, throughout the project, a minimum net worth throughout the project to guarantee that they could step in and complete the project. But other aspects, security, would include, in some instances that we've done successfully, is just a personal corporate guarantee, right. Repayment guarantee, especially if you're in like a first position loan. You might seek that type of backup in addition to the first lien on the property itself.
That's a great point. And another thing to kind of add to that is it kind of also highlights that distinction in some of the protections in the RIA for affiliated and non-affiliated JCEs. Peter, I think you had mentioned that maybe some of these you might be associated to some of these projects. Are you guys working on projects where you guys are an affiliated JCE? And what are some of the hoops that people have to jump through that are different from pre-RIA?
Yeah, we do both. We have projects that we sponsor. We have projects where we're the developer or a co-developer. To be clear, in those types of situations where it's an affiliated JCE, and here we mean that a person in the regional center has an ownership interest in the project, right? The development, the job creating entity. In most situations, the RC is not the only player, the only party in the affiliated JCE. So, for example, like Michael said, you have an institutional bank that's lending to the project. You have other LPs. Those LPs typically are institutional, at least those that we work with, typically public institutions. And you're responsible to them. There's some oversight there. And one of the things that we do, and I'm sure many projects do, is just to have a construction auditor as a third party, oversight and other oversight mechanisms. New to the RIA, not really new to most regional centers, like the quality regional centers, would be the fund administration. That was really just codifying best practices of regional centers. We have a fund administrator in place where they're, co-signatories on the bank accounts, separated bank accounts for the projects, and required reporting mechanisms to that fund administrator to track that funding and to ensure that that's being deployed where it's supposed to be deployed. That's a good thing. I mean, that codification is a good thing. I think that's what we talk about, that flight to quality. Right. It becomes much more expensive as a regional center and as a developer to do EB-5. And not everybody's equipped or willing to raise that level of compliance and quality of their deals. I think that's one of the best things that's come out of this EB-5 3.0 post-RIA.
And, to kind of tie into the overall theme of, attracting investors in your specific capital structure, and really what we're talking about is attracting investors to your projects. Not all investors have the same mindset. Different parts of the country, parts of the world, people are interested in different things. We can go straight down the line on this. How are you seeing kind of the impacts of the RIA, the new types of deals that you're seeing in the market, and then reception to your group's projects? How are you seeing them bear out in different markets?
I think for us, when I've talked to hundreds of investors, especially in this post-RIA climate, that investors are still looking for safety, for quality, and they're looking for a strong platform. The RIA, the lapse caused by USCIS, the hiccuping and stuttering implementation of the RIA processing times, a lot of this just caused a lot of uncertainty and doubt and a little bit of hesitancy about how to approach EB-5 from an investor perspective in my conversations. So they're looking for strong partners, and they're looking for exit strategies. And so that's one of the common questions I have is the project in construction? Is it fully capitalized? Is it going to cash flow? How is it going to cash flow? How quickly is it going to cash flow? And how am I going to get my money back? And I think if you have a project that's already underway, under construction, it's creating those jobs, that kind of mitigates or relieves some of that anxiety. And if you have a regional center platform with strong partners that show that you can be nimble and flexible in a post-COVID, post-RIA environment, it gives investors confidence.
What advice would you give to brand new people in this industry, to someone who's just walked through the door saying, I've got a project and I want to raise EB-5? Is this the time for them to jump in? What should they be thinking? Throw in any closing thoughts you have in there as well.
I'm optimistic for 2023 and going forward. I think, as I mentioned earlier, this has been years in the making, and we're finally implemented. There's a lot of new players here, like we're talking about. I get a lot of new faces for me, too. And I think for a new player, a new person entering into this field, that is really to do what people have been doing here, is just asking questions. And that's one of the things that I think is most exciting when meeting new investors, new migration agents, new developers, is just to engage in dialogue as much as possible, as frequently as possible, and get all your questions answered. It's from a due diligence point of view, it's from an educational point of view. It's something I've taken very seriously, and I almost do like a plug of going to BehringEB5.com, and you'll see our resource. We've just taken an extra step of just with video content, resource content, to just try